the Federation starship, Vanguard, approached Outpost Vega with urgency. From the observation deck, Blake watched the distant flicker of explosions as the outpost's defenses were pushed to the brink. The Xyloxians had already breached several key points, and the scattered communications from survivors painted a grim picture. Coming out of warp in 5, the voice of the ship's pilot crackled over the comms. Blake turned to his team, the familiar weight of his combat armor settling over his shoulders. He had fought countless battles before, but something about this mission felt different. There was no guarantee that they would be able to defeat the Xyloxians. In fact, they knew almost nothing about them. Havoc stood beside him, his own battle gear gleaming. "First contact is always rough," he said, reading the tension on Blake's face. "But we've handled worse." Blake nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this fight wasn't going to be like any other. The Vorak had been powerful, but they had understood them. The Xyloxians were still an unknown, a mystery shrouded in chaos. The ship shuddered as it dropped out of warp, and immediately, the sight of the battle unfolded before them. Outpost Vega was a massive, multi-leveled structure designed to house thousands of Federation personnel, but now it was half in ruins. Several sections of the outer walls had been completely destroyed, and the remaining defense systems were firing desperately at the Xyloxian forces below. "Landing zone is hot," the pilot called out. "Hold on!" The Vanguard dived toward the surface, dodging debris and laser fire from both sides. Blake felt his stomach lurch as the ship twisted and turned, avoiding the deadly beams that crisscrossed the sky. In seconds, they were on the ground, the rear hatch opening to reveal the war zone outside. "Go! Go! Go!" Blake shouted as he led his team out of the ship. The heat of battle hit them immediately. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of explosions filled their ears. The Xyloxians were relentless, their sleek, insectoid forms moving with terrifying speed and precision. They were large, but their exoskeletons were nearly impervious to standard weapons fire. Blake saw a squad of Federation soldiers nearby unload their rifles into one of the creatures, only for it to charge straight through them, cutting them down with bladed appendages. "Focus fire on the joints." Havoc roared, his deep voice carrying over the chaos. Blake raised his pulse rifle and aimed at one of the advancing Xyloxians. He fired a burst, but just as Havoc had said, the shots bounced off the creature's armored carapace. He adjusted his aim, targeting the small gaps between its leg joints. The next burst hit its mark, and the creature stumbled, its movements becoming erratic before it collapsed to the ground. "They're vulnerable at the joints." Blake called out to the others. "Hit them there!" The team spread out, engaging the Xyloxians with precision. It was a brutal fight, with the alien forces showing no signs of retreat. They moved in coordinated swarms, flanking the Federation soldiers and attacking from multiple angles. Blake found himself in constant motion, firing, ducking, and weaving between the debris as the battle raged on. Havoc's deep laugh echoed through the comms as he smashed one of the creatures with the butt of his rifle, sending it sprawling. "They're tough, but not invincible." Blake wasn't as sure. Even with their strategy, the Xyloxians kept coming, wave after wave, showing no signs of tiring. It was as if they had an endless supply of soldiers. For every one they brought down, 2 more seemed to take its place. "Sergeant Blake, come in," a voice crackled over his earpiece. Blake pressed a hand to his comms. "Blake here. What's the situation?" "This is Commander Yara from Command. We've just intercepted a transmission from the Xyloxians. It looks like they're using some kind of hive mind to coordinate their attacks." Blake's eyes widened. "A hive mind?" That explained their relentless coordination, their unerring ability to adapt to the Federation's tactics. "What's the plan?" he asked, already dreading the answer. "We've pinpointed the location of their central command structure," Yara continued. "It's embedded deep within the northern sector of the outpost. If you can take it out, we believe it will disrupt their communications and give us the upper hand." Blake gritted his teeth. It was always the same. go deep into enemy territory and take out the command. But this time, the stakes felt higher. The Xyloxians weren't just enemies, they were something more dangerous. An enemy that thought as one, adapted as one. "We'll get it done," Blake replied, signaling to his team. Blake led his squad through the wreckage of Outpost Vega, the distant sounds of the battle still ringing in their ears. The northern sector was a maze of collapsed buildings and smoldering debris. Every step was treacherous, with the ground beneath them littered with the remains of Federation soldiers and Xyloxian drones. "Keep your eyes sharp," Blake warned, his rifle raised as they moved forward. The sky above them was dark, the clouds churning with the aftereffects of the battle. Fires burned in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow across the landscape. The team moved in silence, their footsteps the only sound in the quiet of the ruined sector. "We're getting close," Havoc muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I can feel it." Blake could feel it too. There was something about the air here, something oppressive. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with the presence of the Xyloxians, their hive mind pulsing with energy that permeated the air around them. As they approached the central command structure, Blake's heart sank. The building wasn't just damaged, it was alive. The Xyloxians had fused their own organic technology into the structure, turning it into something more than just a building. Tendrils of alien matter snaked out from the walls, pulsing with a strange, bioluminescent light. The entrance was guarded by a group of Xyloxian drones, their sharp limbs twitching as they stood sentinel. "We're going to need a distraction," Blake said quietly. Havoc grinned. "Leave that to me." Before Blake could protest, Havoc charged forward, his massive form barreling toward the Xyloxians with a battle cry that shook the ground. The drones turned to face him, their bladed limbs raised, but Havoc was too fast. He crashed into them with the force of a battering ram, sending two of them flying before they could react. Blake didn't waste the opportunity. "Move," he ordered, and the squad sprinted toward the entrance. They made it inside just as the Xyloxians began to recover from Havoc's assault. The interior of the building was even more alien than the exterior. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and strange, organic tubes lined the corridors, carrying some kind of viscous liquid that glowed faintly. "This place is a nightmare," one of the soldiers muttered. Blake couldn't disagree. They moved quickly through the winding corridors, following the signals from their scanners toward the central hive. Every step felt like they were being watched, and Blake had no doubt that the Xyloxians knew they were coming. Finally, they reached the core. It was a massive chamber, dominated by a pulsating mass of organic matter that seemed to be the heart of the entire structure. Tendrils of alien energy reached out from it, connecting to the walls and ceiling in a web of glowing veins. "This is it," Blake said, raising his weapon. "Take it down." The squad opened fire, their pulse rifles sending bursts of energy into the heart of the hive. The mass shuddered under the assault, but it didn't go down easily. It fought back, sending out shockwaves of energy that knocked several soldiers off their feet. Blake gritted his teeth, firing round after round into the core. "We've got to overload it." Havoc, now back from his skirmish outside, joined the attack. He slammed a grenade into the core's base, the explosion sending chunks of alien matter flying. The hive shuddered violently, and Blake could feel the entire building start to shake. "We need to get out of here," he shouted over the comms. The team turned and ran, the sound of the hive collapsing behind them. Tendrils of energy lashed out, trying to catch them as the building began to implode. Blake sprinted toward the exit, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. As they burst out of the collapsing structure, the effect was immediate. The Xyloxians outside faltered, their coordinated movements breaking down as their hive-mind connection was severed. Federation forces quickly capitalized on the confusion, launching a counterattack that drove the remaining Xyloxians into retreat. Blake stood on the battlefield, breathing heavily as the dust settled around him. The battle was over, for now, but he knew it wasn't the end. The Xyloxians were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had claimed what they wanted. But for today, they had won. And that was enough. Blake's mind was racing as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. The wreckage of Outpost Vega lay scattered across the landscape, a testament to the ferocity of the fight that had just unfolded. He could see the remaining Federation troops regrouping, tending to the wounded, and mourning their fallen comrades. He turned to Havoc, who was standing nearby, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," Havoc said, though his voice was subdued. "But at what cost?" Blake nodded. "We lost a lot of good people today. We need to honor their sacrifice by making sure this doesn't happen again." "Agreed." "But how?" Havoc asked, crossing his arms. "This hive mind they have is something we've never encountered before. It makes them a whole different kind of threat." "Then we need to figure out what we're dealing with," Blake said, determination flooding his veins. "We need to study the remains, understand their technology, their biology. If we can get a better grasp of how they operate, we can devise a strategy to fight back." Havoc grinned, a flicker of his usual bravado returning. "Now you're talking. Let's get to work." As they moved toward the command center that had survived the onslaught, Blake felt a sense of purpose wash over him. They had survived today, but the real battle lay ahead. The Xyloxians were relentless, and they would come again. It was only a matter of time before they returned, and when they did, Blake wanted to be ready. The team gathered around the remains of the hive core, now a twisted mass of defeated alien technology. Scientists from the Federation were already setting up equipment to analyze the remains, taking samples and documenting everything they could. Blake watched as they worked, the urgency of the situation pressing heavily on his mind. "Do you think they'll come back?" Havoc asked, his voice low as he joined Blake at the edge of the group. "They have to," Blake replied. "The hive mind was disrupted, but it won't be long before they regroup and strike again. We need to be prepared." The scientists worked tirelessly, and as the hours passed, Blake felt the fatigue of battle settle into his bones. But he couldn't rest, not yet. They needed to gather intelligence, develop a plan, and secure their defenses. As night fell, the atmosphere around the outpost shifted. The fires that had once raged now flickered low, casting shadows across the debris. Blake found himself staring into the distance, where the Xyloxians had retreated, and he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "Something doesn't feel right," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. Havoc followed his gaze, then shrugged. "They'll regroup, sure. But we'll be ready for them. We have to be." Blake turned away, his mind racing. "I hope you're right." The next few days were a blur of activity as the Federation worked to secure Outpost Vega and recover from the attack. They set up defensive perimeters, reinforced key structures, and began to analyze the data collected from the hive core. Scientists were hard at work, studying the Xyloxian biology and technology in hopes of discovering weaknesses. But despite their efforts, Blake could feel the tension rising. The Xyloxians were a new kind of enemy, and he couldn't shake the sense that they were only just beginning to understand the threat they posed. Rumors circulated about the possibility of a larger Xyloxian force gathering, and the urgency of the situation weighed heavily on everyone. One evening, Blake convened a meeting with the key members of the command staff. They gathered in the dimly lit conference room, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the table. Maps and data displays covered the surface, showing the devastation from the battle and potential Xyloxian movements. "Thank you all for coming," Blake said, taking a seat at the head of the table. "We've made significant progress in analyzing the hive core, but we still have a lot to learn about the Xyloxians and their capabilities. We need to prepare for their return." Commander Yara leaned forward, her expression serious. "We've confirmed reports of increased Xyloxian activity in the surrounding systems. It's only a matter of time before they attempt to reclaim what they've lost here." Blake nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "What's our current status on the defense systems?" Lieutenant Carson, the head of engineering, spoke up. "We're upgrading our energy shields and reconfiguring our weapons systems to adapt to Xyloxian biology. We've also requested reinforcements from the nearest fleet, but they won't arrive for another few days. Days we may not have, Havoc muttered, crossing his arms. If they come back, we'll need to hold the line without backup. We also need to figure out how to disrupt their hive mind communication, Blake said, his mind racing with possibilities. If we can find a way to sever their connection before they reach us, we may stand a better chance. Yara nodded. We've been working on a device that could potentially disrupt their signals, but it's still in the experimental stage. We'll need to conduct tests to see if it can be operational in time. Let's move forward with that, Blake commanded. Every second counts. In the meantime, I want scouting teams deployed to monitor the surrounding areas for any signs of Xyloxian movement. As the meeting concluded, Blake felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. The fate of Outpost Vega, and possibly much more, rested on their ability to prepare for the Xyloxians' return. The fight was far from over, and he knew they would need every advantage they could get. Days passed, each one more tense than the last. The sounds of engineers and scientists filled the halls of the command center as they worked tirelessly to bolster defenses and improve their understanding of the Xyloxian threat. Blake spent his days moving between teams, coordinating efforts, and ensuring that everyone remained focused on the mission ahead. Finally, the day arrived when the device designed to disrupt the hive mind was ready for testing. Blake stood alongside Commander Yara and Lieutenant Carson as the scientists prepared the equipment. The prototype was a complex array of sensors and emitters, designed to send out interference waves capable of disrupting the Xyloxian communication network. "Are you sure this will work?" Blake asked, concern creeping into his voice. "We believe so," Carson replied, his brow furrowed with concentration. "But we won't know until we run the test. The key is to ensure the frequencies are tuned properly to match their communication signals." The testing area was set up just outside the perimeter of the outpost, surrounded by reinforced barriers. As the scientists powered up the device, Blake felt a surge of anticipation. If this worked, it could turn the tide of battle. Ready to initiate, one of the scientists called out. "Go ahead," Blake ordered, his heart racing. The device hummed to life, and a low-frequency pulse filled the air. Blake watched closely as the readings on the display began to fluctuate, indicating that the waves were interacting with something. The scientists monitored the signals carefully, adjusting the parameters as needed. Then, without warning, the alarms blared throughout the outpost, echoing ominously in the silence. Blake's stomach dropped. "What's happening?" "We're detecting a massive spike in Xyloxian activity," Yara reported, her eyes wide. "It's as if they'd become aware of our presence. But just the frequencies. We need to stay one step ahead." Blake shouted, adrenaline surging through him. The scientists scrambled to make the necessary adjustments, their fingers flying over the controls. But the readings continued to spike, and Blake could feel the tension rising as the reality of their situation sank in. "Commander, we need to prepare for a potential attack," Havoc urged, his voice grave. "Get everyone to their stations," Blake ordered, his mind racing. "We need to defend this outpost." As the team rushed to mobilize, Blake felt the ground tremble beneath them. The Xyloxians were coming, and they were ready to fight. Moments later, the alarms blared again, this time accompanied by the sound of distant explosions. Blake rushed to the observation deck, his heart pounding as he surveyed the scene outside. The Xyloxians had returned, their numbers overwhelming as they surged toward the outpost, determined to reclaim their lost territory. "Prepare defensive positions," Blake shouted, gripping his rifle tightly. "We need to hold them back." The Federation forces sprang into action, manning their positions as they prepared to defend the outpost. The sounds of battle erupted once more, echoing through the air as pulse rifles fired and grenades exploded. Blake moved among his team, coordinating their efforts as the Xyloxians closed in. "Aim for the joints," he shouted, recalling the tactic that had worked in their previous encounter. The battle raged on, each moment filled with chaos and violence. The Xyloxians fought with a ferocity that was unnerving, their hive mind driving them to attack relentlessly. Blake could see the desperation in the eyes of his soldiers as they fought back against the tide of alien forces. "Flank them on the left!" Havoc bellowed, charging into the fray. Blake followed close behind, firing his weapon as they moved. The Xyloxians were relentless, and for every one they took down, 2 more seemed to take its place. The weight of the battle pressed heavily on Blake's mind, but he refused to give in to despair. They had to hold the line, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the outpost, sending debris flying and knocking Blake off his feet. He landed hard, pain shooting through his side as he scrambled to regain his footing. The blast had created a gap in the defenses, and the Xyloxians were pouring through. "Reinforce the breach!" Blake shouted, struggling to stand. Havoc was already on it, rallying a nearby squad to help him push back against the incoming swarm. But the situation was dire. The Xyloxians were pouring through the gap like a tide, and the Federation soldiers were struggling to hold them back. "Where's the disruptor?" Blake called out, scanning the chaos for any sign of the device. "We're trying to recalibrate it," one of the scientists shouted back, his voice strained with urgency. "But it's taking longer than expected." "Damn it!" Blake cursed, gripping his weapon tightly. "We need it now!" The fighting intensified, and Blake felt a surge of desperation. They had to find a way to regain control of the situation before it was too late. He pushed forward, firing at the advancing Xyloxians and leading his team deeper into the fray. Just when it seemed like they would be overwhelmed, the ground shook once more as the disruptor activated. A wave of energy pulsed out from the device, and Blake could feel the effects immediately. The Xyloxians faltered, their movements slowing as the hive-mind connection weakened. "Now! Push forward!" Blake shouted, rallying his team. With renewed determination, the Federation forces surged forward, taking advantage of the disruption. They fought with a ferocity born from desperation, pushing back against the tide of alien invaders. As they fought, Blake could see the tide beginning to turn. The Xyloxians were struggling to regroup, their hive mind in disarray. With each passing moment, the Federation forces gained ground, forcing the aliens back toward the breach. But just as victory seemed within reach, a massive Xyloxian warrior emerged from the chaos. It towered over the battlefield, its armored exoskeleton glinting in the dim light. The creature let out a roar that sent shivers down Blake's spine, and he knew they were facing a new kind of threat. "Fall back!" Blake shouted, raising his rifle. "Target the warrior!" The squad opened fire, but the creature seemed impervious to their weapons. It charged forward, cutting through the Federation soldiers with terrifying ease. Blake felt a surge of fear, but he pushed it aside. They couldn't give up now. "Focus fire!" "Aim for its joints," he called out, determination surging through him. The team responded, directing their fire at the warrior's legs. With a deafening crash, the creature stumbled, its massive form crashing to the ground. But even as it fell, it continued to fight, swinging its bladed limbs with deadly precision. Blake charged forward, determination coursing through him. They had to take this creature down, or the battle would be lost. He joined Havoc at the front lines, firing at the warrior as it roared in defiance. Together, they pushed back against the creature, coordinating their attacks and taking advantage of the chaos around them. With each shot, they targeted its weak points, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, the warrior collapsed, defeated. With the warrior down, the tide of battle began to shift. The remaining Xyloxians faltered, their hive mind in disarray. Blake and his team pressed their advantage, driving the aliens back and reclaiming control of the battlefield. As the last of the Xyloxians retreated, Blake took a moment to catch his breath, his heart racing with adrenaline. The battle had been fierce, but they had triumphed. For now. But the victory felt bittersweet. They had lost many good soldiers, and the threat of the Xyloxians lingered in the air. Blake turned to Havoc, who was catching his breath beside him. "Did we do enough?" Havoc asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the day. "We held them back," Blake replied, but doubt nodded him. But this isn't over. We need to regroup and prepare for the next wave. As the sun set over Outpost Vega, the team began to assess the damage, tending to the wounded and mourning their fallen comrades. The sounds of battle had faded, but the reality of their situation weighed heavily on everyone's minds. In the days that followed, Blake and his team worked tirelessly to fortify their defenses and gather intelligence on the Xyloxians. They analyzed the data collected during the battle, searching for weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the alien forces. But the feeling of unease remained. They knew the Xyloxians would return, and they needed to be ready. Blake spent long hours poring over the data, trying to make sense of the Xyloxians' tactics and strategies. He met with the scientists, discussing potential countermeasures and ways to disrupt the hive mind more effectively. But no matter how much they learned, the threat loomed large. The Xyloxians were relentless, and Blake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. One evening, as Blake stood on the observation deck, watching the stars twinkle in the darkness, Havoc joined him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, a teasing tone in his voice. "I'm just thinking about the next battle," Blake replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We need to be prepared for anything." "We will be," Havoc reassured him. "We've survived this long, and we'll keep fighting. That's what we do." Blake appreciated Havoc's confidence, but deep down, he knew the truth. They were up against an enemy unlike any they had faced before. The Xyloxians were driven by a singular purpose, and as long as their hive mind existed, they would continue to pose a threat. Over the next few weeks, Blake and his team continued to fortify Outpost Vega. They set up additional defenses, reinforced their energy shields, and conducted training exercises to keep the troops sharp and ready for the next encounter. As they worked, reports continued to trickle in from the surrounding systems. The Xyloxians were regrouping, their numbers swelling as they prepared for another assault. Blake could feel the tension mounting as the outpost became a hub of activity, soldiers and scientists working side by side to ensure they were ready for the inevitable fight. Finally, the day arrived when they received word that the Xyloxians were on the move. Intelligence reports indicated a massive force was approaching, and Blake felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. "Everyone, listen up," Blake called out, gathering the troops. "We've trained for this moment, and now it's time to put that training to the test. The Xyloxians are coming, and we need to be ready to defend this outpost. We've already faced them once, and we know their weaknesses. Let's make sure we use that knowledge to our advantage." The soldiers nodded, determination shining in their eyes. They were ready to fight. As the Xyloxians approached, Blake took his position at the front lines, his pulse rifle at the ready. The sound of their advancing forces echoed in the distance, a low rumble that sent shivers down his spine. "Brace yourselves," Havoc shouted, his voice booming over the noise. The first wave of Xyloxians surged forward, and Blake felt the adrenaline coursing through him. The air crackled with energy as the Federation forces opened fire, targeting the advancing aliens with precision. The battle erupted with a fury, the sounds of gunfire and explosions filling the air. Blake moved through the chaos, coordinating the troops and directing their fire as they pushed back against the oncoming wave. The Xyloxians fought with a relentless intensity, but this time, the Federation forces were ready. They took advantage of their previous encounter, adapting their tactics and exploiting the weaknesses they had discovered. Blake felt a surge of hope as they held the line against the Xyloxians. They pushed back against the tide, forcing the aliens to regroup and retreat under the pressure of their coordinated fire. But just as it seemed they were gaining the upper hand, a new wave of Xyloxians emerged, larger and more aggressive than before. The warrior class had returned, and they were leading the charge. "Focus fire on the warriors," Blake shouted, directing his team to target the imposing figures charging toward them. The Federation forces responded, pouring energy into the advancing warriors. But the aliens were undeterred, their armored exoskeletons deflecting the shots as they charged forward with deadly intent. Fall back. Regroup. Havoc shouted, pushing his way through the chaos. The battle raged on, and Blake felt the weight of the fight pressing down on him. They had trained for this, prepared for the onslaught, but the sheer force of the Xyloxians was overwhelming. Reinforcements, a soldier shouted, pointing toward the sky. Blake looked up to see Federation ships descending from above, their weapons primed and ready to assist. The sight filled him with a renewed sense of hope. They weren't alone. Open fire! Cover our troops! Blake shouted, raising his rifle as the ships unleashed a barrage of fire on the Xyloxians. The aliens faltered under the combined assault, their ranks breaking as they tried to regroup. Blake seized the opportunity, rallying his team to push forward. They fought with everything they had, driving back the Xyloxians as the Federation ships provided cover from above. The tide of battle began to turn, and Blake felt a surge of determination as they pressed their advantage. But just as victory seemed within reach, the ground shook violently as the massive warrior class charged forward once more. Blake braced himself, gritting his teeth as the creature bore down on them, its eyes filled with fury. Focus fire! Don't let it break through! Blake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The team responded, their shots striking the warrior as it advanced. But it was a relentless force, pushing through their lines as if they were nothing. With a final surge of adrenaline, Blake charged forward, determined to face the creature head-on. He joined Havoc at the front, firing his weapon as they fought against the odds. The warrior swung its massive bladed limbs, and Blake ducked just in time to avoid the lethal strikes. With a determined roar, he launched himself at the creature, aiming for its weak points. Together, he and Havoc fought with everything they had, targeting the warrior's joints and exploiting every vulnerability they could find. It was a desperate struggle, but with each blow, they felt the creature's strength waning. Finally, after a fierce battle, the warrior collapsed to the ground, defeated. The remaining Xyloxians faltered, their hive mind disintegrating under the pressure of their losses. With renewed determination, the Federation forces surged forward, driving the Xyloxians back as they pressed their advantage. The tide of battle had turned, and Blake felt a surge of triumph as they reclaimed control of the battlefield. As the last of the Xyloxians retreated, Blake took a moment to catch his breath, his heart racing with adrenaline. They had faced the storm and emerged victorious, but the cost had been high. The outpost was in ruins, the remnants of the battle scattered across the landscape. Blake looked around at the faces of his comrades, a mixture of exhaustion and determination reflected in their eyes. "We did it," Havoc said, clapping Blake on the back. "We held the line." Blake nodded, but the weight of their losses hung heavy in the air. But at what cost? In the days that followed, the Federation worked tirelessly to rebuild. They mourned their fallen comrades and honored their sacrifices, vowing to ensure that their fight against the Xyloxians would not be in vain. Blake threw himself into the recovery efforts, determined to rebuild what had been lost. They fortified the outpost, improving defenses and gathering intelligence on the Xyloxian threat. As the weeks passed, the team worked together to recover from the battle, but the shadow of the Xyloxians loomed large. Reports of their movements continued to come in, and Blake felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. But amidst the uncertainty, he found a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger. Together, they would continue to fight, to protect their home and their people from the relentless tide of the Xyloxians. The fight was far from over, but Blake knew they had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. And with that strength, they would forge a new path forward, a path of resilience, determination, and unyielding courage against the darkness. Act 4, the final showdown. Time passed as the Federation fortified Outpost Vega, gathering intelligence and training for the inevitable confrontation with the Xyloxians. The team worked tirelessly to develop new strategies and tactics, determined to ensure that the sacrifices of their fallen comrades were not in vain. Blake stood in the command center, surrounded by maps and data displays that illuminated the room. Havoc and Yarrow were engaged in a heated discussion about potential defensive measures. "Commander, we need to consider the possibility of a large-scale assault, Havoc argued, his brow furrowed with concern. If the Xyloxians regroup and attack in full force, we need to be ready to respond. Yara nodded, her expression serious. We've already fortified the perimeter and increased patrols, but we need more. We need to think strategically if we want to outmaneuver them. Agreed, Blake chimed in, his mind racing with possibilities. What about deploying scout teams to gather intelligence on their movements? If we can get ahead of them, we might be able to disrupt their plans. Let's get a team ready, Yara replied, her voice steady. We can't afford to be caught off guard again. As they discussed their options, Blake couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The Xyloxians were a new kind of enemy, one that seemed to adapt and evolve with each encounter. They couldn't let their guard down. Days turned into weeks, and tensions mounted as reports continued to filter in from the surrounding systems. The Xyloxians were regrouping, their numbers swelling as they prepared for another assault. Blake felt the pressure weighing heavily on his shoulders, knowing that they needed to be ready for whatever was coming. Finally, the day arrived when they received word that the Xyloxians were on the move. Intelligence reports indicated a massive force was approaching, and Blake knew it was time to put their preparations to the test. Everyone, listen up! Blake called out, gathering the troops once more. The Xyloxians are coming, and we need to be ready to defend this outpost. We've trained for this moment, and now it's time to put that training to the test. Remember your tactics, remember your training, and above all, remember why we're fighting. The soldiers nodded, determination shining in their eyes as they took their positions. Blake felt a surge of adrenaline as he prepared to face the impending storm. The sounds of battle echoed in the distance as the Xyloxians approached, their numbers overwhelming as they surged toward the outpost. The Federation forces stood ready, their weapons primed and their resolve unwavering. As the Xyloxians closed in, Blake barked orders, coordinating the troops as they prepared to defend their home. The battle erupted with a fury, the sounds of gunfire and explosions filling the air. Blake fought alongside his comrades, moving through the chaos and directing fire as they pushed back against the tide of alien invaders. The Xyloxians fought with a relentless intensity, but this time, the Federation forces were prepared. The tide of battle began to turn in their favor as they pushed back against the Xyloxians, driving them away from the outpost. But just as it seemed victory was within reach, a massive wave of warriors surged forward, determined to break through their lines. Fall back! Regroup! Blake shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. But even as they regrouped, the Xyloxians continued to push forward, their hive mind driving them relentlessly onward. Blake gritted his teeth, refusing to give in to despair. They had come too far to turn back now. Focus fire on the warriors, he called out, directing his team to target the imposing figures leading the charge. With renewed determination, they fought back against the tide, targeting the warriors as they pressed their advantage. Blake felt the adrenaline surge through him as they fought with everything they had, pushing back against the relentless waves of Xyloxian forces. But just as it seemed they were gaining the upper hand, the ground shook violently as a massive Xyloxian warship descended from the sky. Blake's heart raced as he realized the true scale of the threat they faced. "Take cover! Prepare for impact," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. The warship opened fire, its cannons raining destruction down upon the battlefield. Blake watched in horror as explosions erupted around them, the force of the blast shaking the ground beneath their feet. "Retreat! Fall back to the command center!" Havoc shouted, rallying the troops as they scrambled to regroup. Blake fought against the tide of chaos, his heart pounding as they retreated to the relative safety of the command center. The Xyloxians continued to push forward, their relentless assault threatening to overwhelm them. Inside the command center, Blake took a moment to catch his breath, his mind racing with possibilities. They needed to regroup, to formulate a new plan if they wanted to survive this onslaught. "Commander, we need to find a way to take down that warship," Yara said, her voice urgent. "It's tearing us apart out there." Blake nodded, determination flooding his veins. We can't let them keep hammering us like this. If we can disable their ship, we might be able to turn the tide. Let's move fast, Havoc urged, his eyes scanning the room. We need to gather the troops and prepare for a counterattack. As they formulated a new plan, Blake felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced impossible odds before, and now it was time to rise to the challenge once more. With a small squad of troops, Blake led the charge back onto the battlefield, determined to take the fight to the Xyloxians. They moved with urgency, dodging incoming fire as they made their way toward the warship. "Keep your heads down," Blake shouted, urging his team forward. The Xyloxians fought with renewed ferocity, but this time, Blake and his squad were ready. They used the cover of smoke and debris to their advantage, moving stealthily as they closed in on the massive warship. As they reached the perimeter of the ship, Blake could see the vulnerable points along its hull. "Aim for those engines. If we can disable their power, we might be able to force them down." The squad responded, opening fire on the exposed engines as they unleashed a hail of energy blasts. The Xyloxians inside the warship scrambled to respond, but Blake could see the damage taking its toll. With each shot, they targeted the weak points of the warship, driving back the Xyloxians who tried to defend it. Blake felt a surge of determination as they pressed their advantage, refusing to back down. Finally, with a deafening explosion, the warship's engines erupted in a fiery blast, sending debris flying into the air. The massive vessel shuddered, losing altitude as it began to crash toward the ground. "Yes! We did it!" Havoc shouted, a grin spreading across his face. But even as the warship fell, the remaining Xyloxians surged forward, determined to regroup and continue their assault. Blake knew they couldn't let their guard down now. "Regroup. Focus fire on the remaining Xyloxians," Blake shouted, rallying his team as they prepared for the final push. With renewed determination, the Federation forces surged forward, driving the remaining Xyloxians back as they pressed their advantage. The tide of battle had turned, and Blake felt a surge of triumph as they reclaimed control of the battlefield. As the last of the Xyloxians retreated, Blake took a moment to catch his breath, his heart racing with adrenaline. They had faced the storm and emerged victorious once more, but the cost had been high. The outpost was in ruins, but they had fought bravely, standing together against the darkness. Blake looked around at the faces of his comrades, a mixture of exhaustion and determination reflected in their eyes. "We did it," Havoc said, clapping Blake on the back. "We held the line." Blake nodded, but the weight of their losses hung heavy in the air. "But we still have a long road ahead of us. We need to rebuild, and we need to prepare for the next encounter." In the days that followed, the Federation worked tirelessly to rebuild. They mourned their fallen comrades and honored their sacrifices, vowing to ensure that their fight against the Xyloxians would not be in vain. As the outpost began to recover, Blake and his team threw themselves into their work, determined to strengthen their defenses and prepare for the inevitable next encounter. They gathered intelligence, reinforced their energy shields, and trained tirelessly, knowing that the threat of the Xyloxians would always loom large. But amidst the uncertainty, they found strength in one another. They formed a bond forged in battle, a camaraderie that would carry them through the darkest times. They would face the storm together, and together, they would fight for their home and their future. As the sun set over Outpost Vega, Blake stood on the observation deck, watching the stars twinkle in the darkness. He felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that they had faced impossible odds and emerged stronger. "Together, we'll face whatever comes next," he whispered to the stars, a vow to himself and his comrades. The fight was far from over, but they had the strength to endure, and with that strength, they would forge a new path forward, a path of resilience, determination, and unyielding courage against the darkness.